Some say that the United States is inferior to Europe because the US has more poverty. Is this true? Let's look at just facts. In a New York Times video that decries fake news and calls for a more truthful approach to the myth that America is the greatest nation on earth, Times producers Tage Jensen and Naima Raza claim that the U.S. has fallen well behind Europe in many respects and has more in common with developing countries than we'd like to admit. One good test of this, they say, is how the U.S. ranks in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, a group of 36 countries predominantly wealthy, Western, and democratic. According to their analysis, America is the richest country, but we're also the poorest, with a whopping 18% poverty rate, closer to Mexico than Western Europe. That assertion prompted Just Facts to conduct a rigorous original study of this issue with data from the OECD, the World Bank, and the U.S. government's Bureau of Economic Analysis. It found that the Times is not merely wrong about this issue, but is reporting the polar opposite of reality. In fact, after accounting for all income, charity, and non-cash welfare benefits like subsidized housing and food stamps, the poorest 20% of Americans consume more goods and services than the national averages for all people in most OECD nations, including the majority of its European members. In other words, if the U.S. poor were a nation, it would be one of the world's richest. It's worth noting that Just Facts' study was reviewed by Dr. Henrike Schneider, professor of economics at Nordacademy University in Germany and chief economist of the Swiss Federation of Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises. After examining the source data and Just Facts methodology, he concluded, "This study is sound and conforms with academic standards. I personally think it provides valuable insight into poverty measures and adds considerably to this field of research." So what explains the disparity between the Just Facts study and the Times video? First, the Times ignores a glaring note located just above the OECD's data for poverty rates. This note explains that these rates measure the relative poverty within nations, not between nations. As it says, the figures represent portions of people with less than half the median household income in their own nations, and thus two countries with the same poverty rates may differ in terms of the relative income level of the poor. The upshot is laid bare by the fact that this OECD measure assigns a higher poverty rate to the US, 17.8%, than to Mexico, 16.6%. Yet World Bank data shows that 35% of Mexico's population lives on less than $5.50 per day, as compared to only 2% of people in the United States. Hence, the OECD's poverty rates say nothing about which nation is the poorest. But this is exactly how the Times misrepresented them. The same point applies to broader discussions about poverty, which can be measured in two very different ways. One, relative poverty, or two, absolute poverty. Relative measures like the one cited by the Times can be misleading if the presenter does not answer the question, poor compared to who? Absolute measures of poverty, like the number of people with income below a certain level, are much more straightforward and enlightening. Another flaw in the Times analysis is the use of incomplete data. To accurately compare living standards across or within nations, it's necessary to account for all major aspects of material welfare. But the OECD data cited by the Times excludes a host of non-cash government benefits and private charity that are abundant in the United States. Examples include, but are not limited to, healthcare provided by Medicaid, free clinics and the Children's Health Insurance Program, nourishment provided by food stamps, school lunches, school breakfasts, soup kitchens, food pantries, and the Women's, Infants, and Children's Program, housing and amenities provided through rent subsidies, utility assistance, and homeless shelters. The aforementioned World Bank data includes those items, but is still incomplete because it's based on government household surveys, and U.S. low-income households greatly underreport both their income and non-cash benefits in such surveys. This is documented by the U.S. Census Bureau, the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, and a paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives entitled Household Surveys in Crisis. There's a wider lesson here. When politicians and the media talk about income inequality, they often use statistics that fail to account for large amounts of income and benefits received by low and middle income households. This greatly overstates inequality and feeds deceptive narratives. A far more reliable indicator of people's well-being is their consumption of goods and services. This is World Bank's preferred indicator due to practical reasons of reliability and because consumption is thought to better capture long-run welfare levels than current income. The World Bank publishes a comprehensive data set on consumption that isn't dependent on the accuracy of household surveys, and it includes all goods and services, but it only provides the average consumption per person in each nation, not the poorest people in each nation. However, the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis published a study that provides exactly that for 2010. Combined with World Bank data for the same year, these data sets show that the poorest 20% of U.S. households have higher average consumption per person than the averages for all people in most nations of the OECD and Europe. An important strength of this data is that it is adjusted for purchasing power to measure tangible realities like square feet of living area, foods, smartphones, etc. This removes the confounding effects of factors like inflation and exchange rates. Thus, an apple in one nation is counted the same as an apple in another. Of course, the high consumption of America's poor doesn't necessarily mean they live better than the average people in nations they outpace, like Spain, Denmark, Japan, Greece, and New Zealand. This is because people's quality of life also depends on their communities and personal choices, like the local politicians they elect, the violent crimes they commit, and the spending decisions they make. For instance, a Department of Agriculture study found that U.S. households receiving food stamps spend about 50% more on sweetened drinks, desserts, and candy than on fruits and vegetables. In comparison, households not receiving food stamps spend slightly more on fruits and vegetables than on sweets. Nonetheless, the fact remains that the privilege of living in the U.S. affords poor people with more material resources than the averages for most of the world's richest nations. In light of these facts, the Times claim that the U.S. has more in common with developing countries than we'd like to admit is especially far-fetched. In 2010, even the poorest 20% of Americans consumed 3 to 30 times more goods and services than the averages for all people in a wide array of developing nations around the world. It's a big reason why people from developing nations immigrate to the U.S. instead of the other way around. Instead of maligning the United States, the Times could have covered this issue in a way that would help people around the world improve their material well-being by replicating what makes the U.S. so successful. However, this would conflict with other false reports by the Times that glorify international socialism and disparage U.S. capitalism. I'm Amanda Reed Sheik, here with Just Facts. For thorough documentation of every fact in this video and more facts about this issue, read the article "The Poorest 20% of Americans Are Richer on Average Than Most Nations of Europe" at justfacts.com.